Welcome to In Defense of the Revolution, a Cuba Solidarity podcast from a Canadian perspective. My name is Cam Scott, and I am here with Samantha Hislop to talk about new developments in Cuban politics and in the solidarity movements with Cuba. It's been a week of further escalations, always further escalations from the United States, with the U.S. Embassy in Cuba promising further sanctions. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that, Samantha.
Yeah, so this just came in a couple hours ago. Reuters reported it, and I think some other outlets are reporting it now too, that Cuba's foreign ministry has issued a verbal warning to the top U.S. diplomat in Havana. That's Mike Hammer, who's the head of the U.S. mission in Cuba. They've issued a verbal warning to him, calling his behavior interventionist. He, has been touring around across Cuba. I think it said in Miami, so it looks like he flew back to Miami after this tour to hold a press conference, and that's where he threatened or announced that the United States would be pursuing further sanctions on Cuba, and that this is just the beginning. So let's, rewind a little bit and just go over why Cuba would have issued this verbal warning. So what he's been doing, Mike Hammer, is that he's been traveling across Cuba to various provinces over the past 6 months since he's been there. He hasn't been there that long. And he's been meeting with opposition groups, specifically in Cuba. He's including people who have received money, that either personally or their organizations have, are funded by USAID or National Endowment for Democracy, depending on what kind of work that they do or their organization does. He's meeting with these people, and he's claiming that he knows what the overall sentiment is of Cubans in Cuba, and that they feel that the revolution has failed. And he emphasizes that the Cuban people are acknowledging that those responsible for, the blackouts and the shortages of fuel and food and medicine, he says that the Cuban people blame that on the Cuban government, and it has nothing to do with any U.S. policy, and that this is what the vast majority of Cubans believe right now. So he's doing this at a very difficult time in Cuba after escalating rounds of sanctions after sanctions from the United States onto Cuba since 2021. Well, before that, but it really got bad in 2021. It hasn't really stopped. So Mike Hammer's been meeting with families of Cuban dissidents. They call them political prisoners, but it's important to note that in most cases, they're not really political prisoners. He's been meeting with small business owners and just what he calls everyday Cubans in Cuba. And, like photo ops, playing with kids in the street, playing dominoes, visiting the grave of, I think it was Jose Marti, who would be rolling in his grave, talking with family members, some people who are currently serving sentences in Cuba. And he's trying to paint this picture that the U.S. is not targeting the Cuban people, it's concerned about targeting the Cuban government. Of course, the truth is that the pressure has been escalating for years, the financial pressure on Cuba from the United States. They put Cuba back on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. They just put Cuba a few weeks ago back on the list of countries that do not cooperate in counterterrorism. They've made it very difficult for Cubans to send money back to their families. They've stopped programs like legal pathways for Cubans to migrate to the United States. They're denying visas to diplomats, academics, athletes. We'll go into that a little bit later. But after this tour and these photo ops and meeting with these opposition leaders and dissidents and people who have been working for U.S. government agencies and funded by U.S. government agencies, he gave a press conference. And supposedly it was tightly controlled who was allowed into this press conference, which I don't doubt at all, because there were no hard questions asked. It was in Miami, mind you, but I'm sure there are journalists that would have had some challenging questions that would have liked to have been there, but they weren't permitted entry. So we had this press conference in Miami where he's said this is just the beginning. We're planning more sanctions on people that we perceive to be repressing the Cuban people, whether it be members of government or, I mean, they just say whatever they want, right? So working for the Cuban government could mean almost anything, basically. I think we talked about this in a few episodes back. Even people that are members of their local CDR, their Committee for the Defense of the Revolution, could be targets of personal targets of sanctions from the United States. So that affects the majority of the population. If we're going to talk about the United States saying that they're going to focus their sanctions on people that are part of the government or repress the Cuban people. So we don't know what those sanctions are going to look like. I'm sure we'll find out soon. But he completely denied that any of the hardships in Cuba right now are caused by the United States policy against Cuba. And he claims to speak for all Cubans, saying that, the Cuban people believe that their country's leaders are responsible for all the country's problems, and it's got nothing to do with U.S. policy. So there was actually a detailed kind of fact-checking response that was given by Joana Tablada, who is the Deputy Director General of the Cuban Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She went through a lot of these lies and claims that Mike Hammer made in this press conference that he held in Miami after this tour. She goes into a decent amount of detail and explains the falsehoods and kind of debunks his claims. So I already said this. So he's claiming that, the shortages, the electrical blackouts have nothing to do with U.S. politics. That's a pretty easy one. We talk about this all the time. So sanctions do have a direct and severe impact on access to funding, technology inputs, and medicine. And this is recognized by the UN, and they're the main obstacle to Cuba's development. So that's an easy debunk. And she explains that he deliberately omitted the blockade, which prohibits international banking transactions, penalizes ships that dock in Cuban ports, hinders the purchase of fuel, and all of these other coercive measures to destabilize and try to dominate Cuba. So it's manipulation in that, yes, there is an economic crisis and nobody is denying that, but he's blaming it exclusively on the Cuban government, as the United States always does, which is a pure simplification, and it totally ignores the multifaceted financial and commercial war of the United States against Cuba that's been for over 60 years. And then another thing that Tablada talks about too is political manipulation. So Mike Hammer, what he said was, I go out, I'm out in the streets, I'm traveling across Cuba, I'm meeting with people as I did in other countries, because he had other posts. I think he was in Africa. He's a career diplomat. So, I'm doing what I've done in other countries. I'm meeting with people. There's nothing in the Vienna Convention that stops me from doing that, which is misleading, because the Vienna Convention explicitly prohibits interference in internal affairs of the receiving country, and that includes systematic contacts with opposition or support for destabilizing actors, which is literally what he is doing and what he has been doing since he arrived 6 months ago. Imagine if a Cuban diplomat made that kind of tour in the United States, how that would go over, that kind of interference, meeting with individuals and groups who are in the United States who are violating laws or attempting against, to overthrow the government, right? Come on. So it's manipulation that he's claiming that these encounters are just with regular, ordinary Cuban people, and they're not. They're specific people. Tablada calls it a strategy of soft destabilization, which is usually a part of these kind of regime change operations that the United States undertakes in other countries. Another point she made was his whitewashing of these people, of these destabilizing figures, as she calls them. So he says that he's visiting artists, youths, and relatives of so-called political prisoners.
Yeah.
Okay. he completely omits that these people are figures that are funded directly or indirectly by the United States to pose as victims of the quote unquote Cuban regime. And he conceals that these people openly call for subversion, sabotage, and violent acts. Literally throwing stones, destroying public transportation, buses. A train was just derailed a few days ago, and there's an investigation going on that it was an act of sabotage. Actually, we don't have all the details, so I'm just mentioning that as an example, like these kind of acts, violent acts. He's meeting with people who are doing these kind of things, right? They call them political prisoners, but most of them have previous criminal records. They've committed crimes outside of the political realm, usually some kind of violent crime, or perhaps something financial, a financial crime, theft, robbery, something against the Cuban people, or and then she talks about he just lies about the blockade. He says that the embargo allows food and medicine into Cuba.
It certainly
doesn't. We hear
doesn't.
this all the time. I get so tired of having to explain to people or debunk it to people who know it's a lie but repeat it anyways. It's just like, so there are some legal exceptions, but the licensing system that the United States has to be able to sell those things to Cuba, and the financial persecution and the fear of secondary penalties that these companies have that also prevent banks or shipping companies that kind of scare these companies from freely selling to Cuba, including food and medicine, those are real. Okay, in theory, they say, yeah, it's supposed to be legal, but in reality, there's all of these obstacles, a really cumbersome licensing system, and also very preferential treatment when they do give contracts. I don't know if it was like the companies that sell chicken or what it was, but we found this list one time of companies that had like OFAC licenses to sell. It was mostly, I think, like agricultural goods or food, and like the vast majority were located in South Florida. So the people who get the contracts are obviously probably powerful business people, probably Cuban heritage, getting preferential treatment to sell to the Cuban market. So he lies. So that's another lie that he told in this press conference, completely glossing over and downplaying the effect that the sanctions have on the importation and the purchasing of food and medicine for Cuba. And then she talks about the diplomatic inconsistency of Mike Hammer and the administration's propaganda. So Mike Hammer says the policy of the Trump administration is clear. We're going tough against the regime, but we're providing support for the people. And this is, as Joanna Tablada calls it, a dangerous contradiction, because the support for the Cuban people includes these sanctions that threaten the livelihood of the population, and it provokes and aggravates the everyday anguish of the Cuban people for their own political purposes. So they're harming the general population really badly. They're not supporting the Cuban people. And there's no such thing as support for the people. You're not supporting the people when you're cutting off remittances, when you're trying to block tourism, when you've closed consulates in the past, and family reunification is so difficult between Cuban families in the United States and Cuba, and trade with Cuba is virtually criminalized. So they're not supporting the Cuban people. And then the administration has also, even since the last Trump administration, they've encouraged irregular migration. So Mike Hammer says, all the Cubans tell me they want to come to the US and they love our culture. That's interesting. So he exaggerates migration as if it were just like a generalized desire to want to come to the US, as if there's no like other factors that are pushing people to leave their homeland. It's a crisis that's been induced by US policy, US economic suffocation, as well as disinformation. being bombarding the Cuban population, especially the younger people, and painting a picture of what life in the United States is in the imperial core, that it's such a better life and you can have it all kind of thing. I have a ton of anecdotes about that, about people who very quickly realized things were not as they thought they were once they arrived to the United States. But that's another conversation. Joanna Tablada also calls out his hypocrisy about, freedom of press, because in that press conference, he claims in Cuba, there's no freedom of press. The independent media tells the truth. Well, these independent media outlets, most of them are directly funded by the United States or their agencies like the National Endowment for Democracy or USAID. So these supposed, what he calls independent outlets in Cuba, they're actually extensions of US foreign policy. They're not free press. They're being paid and they're selected to do this work. They wouldn't be getting this funds if they weren't doing the work. Essentially, the US State Department would want them to be doing. They wouldn't be getting grants and funding. Oh, and another thing she says is they don't. He didn't mention repression in the United States. So we've seen repression and censorship towards progressive and pro-Cuba media in the United States. There's also obviously outside of the United States as well, repression against journalists reporting on Palestine. That's been all over Europe and Canada as well. So just complete hypocrisy.
Yeah.
So Tablada summarizes her response to this press conference by saying that Mike Hammer's speech in this conference after his tour, it was not a neutral press conference. It was a political communication operation that's designed to paint a picture of a failed state of Cuba, legitimize U.S. diplomatic interference that he's been doing as solidarity with the Cuban people, to gloss over U.S. sanctions and disregard the blockade completely, strengthen the U.S.-funded counter-revolutionary figures in Cuba and paint them as legitimate spokespeople or as representing the will of the Cuban people, and also to just generally position the Trump administration and Marco Rubio as allies to the Cuban people. So it was a propaganda, a communications operation, as she says, and I think she explains it all really, really well in what she wrote. It's ironic that Mike Hammer put so much emphasis on solidarity with the Cuban people, as we've also seen in recent news reports that Cuban athletes are being denied visas to participate in sporting events taking place in the United States, including like qualifying competitions. So we've got the U.S. denying athlete visas, and we're also seeing that Cuban exiles living in the United States are now themselves facing deportation from the very administration that they support or supported and likely voted in if they have citizenship. So there's a whole lot of irony going on here, I think.
So, certainly, I mean, the United States is, I believe, one of the host countries of the 2026 World Cup, as well as the 2028 Olympic Games, which are going to be in Los Angeles. So they are using this advantage to further penalize the Cuban people, Cuban athletes, and so on. And the Cuban Olympic Committee has very strongly criticized the United States. It's funny because I can remember, as will we all, people boycotting various host countries of the Olympics because of their human rights records and so on. And I think that an Olympic Games in Trump America, which is otherwise trying to separate from the world and is so terribly xenophobic and nativist and so on, is going to produce a similar jarring sort of effect. I don't think it'll just be Cubans, but how are you going to have a celebration of international sportsmanship or what have you when your signal policies are the deportation of so many undocumented and, honestly documented immigrants, including Cubans, but many others? It's a pretty jarring contrast, as Cuba's Olympic Committee has pointed out.
And we've also got Cuban exiles in the United States having their nerves racked right now because even they, in some cases, are receiving deportation orders. Whereas previously, up until this point, they had been very well sheltered. The Cuban legal path actually to permanent residency historically has been very quick and seamless and automatic, right? So until now, the way that it worked is if they arrived in the United States, they would have 1 year of, they call it like parole. And then at the 1 year mark, they can apply for permanent residency status in the US. And that was like pretty much a guarantee. So now I don't know if Cuban permanent residents in the United States are facing any uncertainties or issues, because usually with permanent residency in a country, you're like pretty stable, pretty safe, so long as you don't commit a crime. Like, it depends on the country and what the laws are, but usually if you have permanent residency, you're more or less pretty stable. So I don't know if those are affected, but any Cuban now who is not a permanent resident or hasn't finished that process, if it's in process, if they just started the process, if it's almost finished and they're almost there, they just haven't had their final meeting to get their visa or whatever, those people are all now feeling at risk, and that includes Cuban immigrants who fully supported this administration and its re-election, whether they could vote or not. Now they're kind of on the receiving end of the terror and the uncertainty that other immigrants from, the region have always had to face when living in the United States, even when they've pursued like a legal path. So it's interesting to see how this is playing out right now. Yeah, go ahead, Cam. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm not sure of the standing of, is it like the Q6 was the green card that was specifically available to Cubans who were paroled after the revolution. I don't know the standing of these various preferential documents, but Trump has induced a major shock within these expat communities that strongly support the GOP and its intensifications against the Cuban government. It's a very jarring contradiction on the face of it. So, this is almost 2.5 million Cuban Americans, really, who have repaid this expedited path to a level of participation in U.S. Economic life and political life and so on that is just not available to other migrants from really anywhere in the Americas. They've repaid this by giving the GOP, and particularly the hard right of the GOP, a strong mandate time and again. And yet Trump, as we discussed in March, revoked the humanitarian parole for, it was Cubans and Haitians, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, and so on, but that encompasses 300,000 Cubans. So there are detainees in the ranks of those 300,000 who would have been very strongly pro-Trump. Many of these Cuban Americans remain, it's a cruel optimism, fairly unshakable in their certainty that Trump is pursuing the correct course against the Cuban government. There are some signs that I have read in AP News and various other outlets. And, the coverage of this issue in AP News is always going to be a little dubious. But there are some signs of U.S. groups, probably backed by the Democratic Party, trying to instigate a cleave in these Cuban American expat communities. People taking out great advertisements, accusing by name Republicans who would be anti-Cuba hardliners. We've talked about Maria Elvira Salazar and so on this podcast as well. There are billboards right now that accuse them of treachery because of how these escalations have exposed Cuban Americans to deportation. So it's really tricky. A lot of people who would have been Cuban government functionaries, and if you look at the stated means by which the U.S. intended to infiltrate and weaken the revolution, they were targeting high-ranking members of the Cuban government and people with quite a high profile in Cuban society and hoping to turn them. And to little avail, this is one of the very interesting admissions of some of these declassified documents, is that historically they had a very hard time breaking apart the solidarity of the people with the revolution. But there are people who, because of their former rank in Cuban intelligence and so on, would have been assets to the U.S. government, who are now being marked by these new policies for extreme suspicion and deportation. I think that there was a list of 108 people who were marked as former Communist Party officials or state agents or so on, living unlawfully in the States. But then there's people who are very well enfranchised and have been anti-Cuban hardliners who find themselves under extreme suspicion because of this escalation against former Cuban statespeople. So the target list is very conflicted, and I think it remains to be seen whether or not it really breaks apart the bloc of right-wing anti-government Cuban expats who have been such a quietly influential part of American politics. I'm not even sure why I say quietly. Often quite vocal. But I should say, relative to the size of this population, a very, very influential cross-section of the U.S. population. And this is either a serious setback or it's kind of a glitch in the program. It's really hard to know what's going on. People who have been very valuable in terms of the contrived dissent against the government, the Patria y Vida slogan that motivated a lot of the anti-government protests in 2021. That was a U.S. authored song as well. And the Cuban American rapper El Funky, who was part of the team behind that song, also received notice that he has 30 days to get out of the United States this month. So this is how they repay the loyalty. And I mean, what is loyalty among, fairly treacherous people, right? It's not a value that I think anyone professes here. Everyone is quite mercenary in this regard. But this is how the Trump administration is repaying the loyalty of some of the major players in this recent sequence of anti-government agitation and contrived civil unrest and so on. I don't know what's going to happen to El Funky, but it's really hard to shed a tear for someone who has gone out of his way, widely out of his way, to injure so many people. And yet he goes this way because hundreds of thousands of other people are in a terribly precarious situation. And whatever their political loyalty, we know that this is business as usual for the United States. And it's only that this one right-wing section of the population was momentarily exempted because it was politically expedient, and now that's changed.
Mm-hmm. I know we try not to like speculate too much, and we wait and see how things play out, but we always give we share our feelings about a situation. And I just don't see how, in the case of El Funky, the rapper, there won't be an intervention. Like, I just don't see him getting deported in the end. So when that came out that he received the deportation order, the 30-day deportation order, that was like a couple days ago. So by the end of June, we'll know. But I know that Maria Elvira Salazar is working, like, has been personally contacted by his, immigration representative or whatever. I just don't think he will end up getting deported. But I don't know. It doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. And like you said, I would not shed a tear. I'm just thinking of what might happen, and I don't see that happening.
I don't see him getting deported. Neither do I. I mean, he'll successfully appeal. Someone will come to his rescue. Yeah. This is the trick. The pushback, it's interesting. From, I don't recall the name of the federal judge, to this summary deportation of, again, the entirety of the people who were granted humanitarian parole under this Biden-era program. That's Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans. Was challenged in court because what Trump is doing is apparently unconstitutional, and every one of these cases ought to have come up for individual evaluation, I believe was the ruling.
Yeah.
So yeah. I think that this is basically just some kind of clerical side effect of this unconstitutional summary deportation. And I think we're stuck with El Funky. I think that he'll probably have a long, grating musical career in right-wing agitprop. But it is an interesting thing to observe nonetheless.
Yeah.
It does seem to be a break with very well established Cold War protocols toward Cuba, And I think that that's how I would encourage people to look at this. If you didn't listen to last week's episode, we had Camila Escalante on to talk about the National Endowment for Democracy and some of the contradictory effects of the Trump administration's summary defunding of regime change programs, soft power, the typical sort of Cold War means by which the United States has courted reactionary sympathy in socialist or non-aligned countries and so on. This is something to track because it seems like an important respect in which the Trump administration is pivoting from the U.S. playbook. At the same time, the Cold War, by very, very conventional means, is intensifying on other fronts. And it's deja vu all over again, as they say. There's still more noise about Chinese spy bases in Cuba, where the U.S. prefers always to impugn Cuba as a proxy of a more frightful pole of global influence, right? But these reports, we glossed this quickly before, they are preposterous. There's 4 possible locations that are being singled out on the basis of the flimsiest of evidence, some inconclusive aerial photography. We spoke before about the evidence presented by Ryan Berg, for example, who's the director of the Americas program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So not the Canadian CSIS, but probably having a mission in common with the Canadian CSIS. And this evidence is just scant. They're looking for locations for a signals intelligence nexus. But these reports, they're produced notably by a project called Hidden Reach, which is intended to shine light on China's far-reaching influence through satellite imagery. These reports are insistent that the presence of antenna arrays and radar capacity and so on at these Cuban military bases could only mean Chinese influence. Belly of the Beast reproduced some really interesting interviews from former CIA as well as locals that confirm, there's a base. I don't recall the locations, near Havana, near Santiago. Of course there's a base there, but the radar technology is perhaps even out of date. It's a Cuban base. It's entirely legitimate. Why shouldn't Cuba have adequate capacity to monitor
and defend itself?
Absolutely. To monitor, for example, an illegal U.S. occupation of Cuba. Like a lot of the reporting on this is really, really fretful that these bases could provide China a strategic vantage upon the naval base at Guantanamo, right? But never mind China. Why would Cuba not wish to monitor the goings-on of an illegal occupation of its own territory? That's a completely legitimate
Absolutely.
Prospect. And it doesn't really need any sort of vast conspiratorial Cold War narrative. I mean, the Cold War continues in the very presence of the Guantanamo naval base. All of these accusations are so easily turned back upon the United States.
And it's reading some of the reports, even some that were from last year. It's like hilarious. It's kind of funny reading them because they use titles and subtitles about new revelations or new evidence of Chinese spy bases. And then when you start reading it, it could be anything. And they say that in the article too. They're like, well, satellite imagery shows this, which could be used for this purpose. We see this, it could be used for this. Okay, that's not evidence. And then I was also looking at a timeline of Cuba, China, military ties. And it listed it had a bunch of years and a description of different events, trying to support this claim of increasing military cooperation between China and Cuba, which, okay, fine, and what? but some of the things that they're citing, for example, 3 People's Liberation Army naval ships dock in Havana to commemorate 55 years of diplomatic relations between China and Cuba. That was one of the things in this list. That happened in 2015. That's pretty standard. That's got nothing to even do with military cooperation. I mean, I think the Canadian Navy did the same thing to celebrate our diplomatic ties last year, was it? Remember?
Yeah.
That's just something that countries do, right? And another one was this vice chairman from China and this government official from Cuba pledged that Cuba and China have an unbreakable relationship. That is cited. These kinds of silly things are cited as these growing ties between Cuba and China, military ties. And it's just they're cooperating and collaborating and doing things that countries do all the time with each other. It's just funny. They're reaching so far and so hard. But the thing is, people don't really, first of all, the average person reading this might still not see the things that we're seeing the way that we're seeing them. But most people don't read these long articles. Anyways, they're seeing the headlines. They're just reading those blurbs, those banners that go across the I've got one of those, I've got like I call it the propaganda screen in the building I live in the elevator, the screens in the elevator where they put like news, but they're just like little snippets and talking points. And it's like always like totally misleading. But that's what these headlines are, right? And people see that Chinese spy bases, and they just keep, they're just increasing those claims like weekly now. I find in the past couple of days, it's really ramped up. Chinese spy bases. They're really trying to plant that in the public's head, even though there's no evidence of it really. And also, like you said, there's totally legitimate reasons why Cuba would and should be protecting itself anyway. And we don't even have to talk about all of the military bases and spy bases that the U.S. has around the world.
Yeah, well, it's true that there are two layers of this debunking and or pushback, where on one hand this coverage is deceitful and it is largely fabricated and from the flimsiest evidence. Well, that's one layer. And the other layer is that we ought to advocate for, Cuban sovereignty on Cuba's own terms. It's just entirely legitimate for Cuba to maintain some kind of defense infrastructure when it is aggressed upon so frequently, and only more so today. I don't think that China has a foothold in Cuba. There's literally no evidence. We should repeat that. There is no evidence to suggest as much. But Cuba can have its own relationships as well, I suppose. This is another thing worth saying. The United States, as you point out, has hundreds of military bases surrounding China. There's 70 odd in South Korea and more than 100 around Japan, and more in the Philippines. And
well, the U.S. has operational...
You can't even begin to enumerate them.
The U.S. has operational control of the South Korean army.
Yeah.
So how should China feel about that then?
That's a major incursion. But again, I think we should always return to the scandalous ongoing occupation of Guantanamo. The United States maintains a base on Cuban soil. So again, I think defending the premise that Cuba can develop its antenna array or whatever defensive capacity it wishes is also important pushback. That said, if you read this article, this is very frightening. The other signs of Chinese influence that they point to are Chinese aid in solar power. They are construing very, very peaceful, obviously constructive developments in Cuba as a sign of political influence or overreach. And we've simultaneously been discussing the blackouts, which the U.S. will not hesitate to manipulate for the purposes of regime change and anti-government agitation. And there's no way out of this impasse, as we've discussed as well. Cuba's Soviet-era power grid is just not adequate to the task of, so on one hand, to the task of powering an island under blockade, nor to Cuba's own environmental plan. Cuba itself has flagged this repeatedly, and the plan to build, I believe, 92 solar parks by 2028 is substantially dependent, if not entirely dependent, on Chinese solar technology. Yeah. Without that outlay, we are not going to see Cuba meet its climate goals. We are not going to see Cuba overcome one of the most painful shortfalls of the blockade, which is obviously to do with energy production, and it impacts everything. The Cuba watchers construe this outlay on solar parks and solar technology as a sign of frightening Chinese political influence. I'm not sure, honestly, that Canada can pivot quickly enough to solar energy without Chinese technology.
Oh, no.
I'm not sure that anyone in the world can. And as we're talking about the necessity of multilateral trade, we should also flag this as a priority for Canadians. But then I read an article the other week that was scaremongering about a supposed kill switch on all of the solar panels in the United States that had been purchased from China, as if this technology was actually a weapon and China was just waiting for America to become dependent on Chinese solar panels and then they would turn them all off. And, you know, it's preposterous. So this can't really be taken seriously, but there was a very interesting article that Robert sent the other day that was part of this Covering Climate Now project that I thought was actually very clear-sighted about the effects of the blockade on Cuba's waste management and environmental services and so on. But it reproduced some quotes from the director of the Cuban Academy of Sciences, who was very clear that fuel is so scarce that the systems, the public systems that Cuba had developed around environment and so on cannot be sustained under these conditions. This is, again, definitely part of the U.S. plan. There's no way for Cuba to protect biodiversity or to meet its climate goals or to address all of these areas of really pressing concern. And I would implore people to look into the seriousness of Cuba's language on environment as they face down the effects of catastrophic climate change, largely instigated by the capitalist bloc of which they are no part, right? But there's people who are cutting away at forest, according to this story, because they need to burn wood for fuel. All these little individual scale ways in which people are forced to offset the disastrous impact of the blockade on the energy sector can't be taken in hand without international financing for renewable energy. That's the bottom line. And China is going to play a major, major part in this. That is inescapable. And this isn't a sign that Cuba is politically subservient to China. The article is also very, very clear-sighted about that Cuba's autonomy and Cuba's, they don't use the word, but Cuba's sovereignty really does depend on international financing and external systems in these relationships, such as they're pursuing with China. So to target those relationships, which has always been the point of the blockade, is really to not only crush the Cuban people in the day-to-day, but it's actually to enlist the very frightening effects of climate change and environmental degradation in the war on the Cuban people. It's actually to poison the environment against the Cuban people in a way that can hardly be taken in hand, given their isolation. So it's a very frightening implication of the blockade that it can even weaponize nature against a people.
And in other news, you were talking about the weaponization of nature. Another realm that Cuba finds itself a target of attack in is cyberspace. A report just came out a couple of days ago that Spain was behind a massive hacking operation against Cuba and other countries, but it turns out that Cuba was the most targeted country by this Spanish government hacking group called Corrado. We won't go all the way into, we won't deep dive into it today, but it's a really interesting report. And it turns out that the Spanish government was undertaking espionage via cyber attacks against countries where it was pursuing its geostrategic interests. And among the countries that were victim of these attacks, Cuba was the biggest recipient of these attacks, including an entire institution in Cuba, actually. But we will give more details in coming days, I think, about that.
Yeah, the actual technical report is very foreboding to look at if you are not savvy in terms of, I suppose, malware and things like this. But again, this malware, this group Mask Carreta, was connected to the government of Spain some time ago by Kaspersky, I suppose, is the researcher, the kind of watchdog. And their malware that has been used to hack into government institutions and private companies around the world seems to have been pretty well documented, insofar as it shows a particular stake in Cuba. It's speculated that this concerns attempts to link Cuba to Basque groups like the ETA.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see how all of these governments, and of the Western governments that maintain easily disavowable but as readily attributable hacking programs like this, cyber espionage and so on, I think that this is probably one of the best documented, so claims this report. We see how all of these governments are trying to gain a foothold in Cuba or some kind of advantage over Cuba insofar as they see it as a proxy for some either kind of nefarious foreign interest or something like this. And on one hand, this is a fabrication, or as we've discussed in a different register, it's just a determined misconstrual of Cuba's internationalism and of its relationships with very, very many groups and factors around the world. And it's crucial to Cuba's sovereignty that we defend its right to preserve those relationships as Cuba sees fit. This will be an interesting story to watch unfold, if it's possible to glean much from behind the scenes of a very shadowy operation, because Spain has previously opposed Cuba's place on the state sponsors of terrorism list, at the same time as, the pretense for Cuba being placed on the state sponsors of terrorism list more recently, it had very much to do in the last days of the first Trump administration with the presence, supposedly, of ELN members in Cuba and a refusal to extradite to Colombia, right? So similarly, Spain had been requesting the extradition of two members of the ETA, like a Basque Liberation Army. This is part of the pretense under which Cuba appears on the state sponsors of terrorism list, though it's evidently false. The insinuation that anyone is planning terrorist operations anywhere in the world from Cuba. That's preposterous. So I'm curious. It's very hard to glean from these reports that Kaspersky has published what exactly was the motivation behind these attacks. But as you say, Samantha, it seems like Cuba was the most frequently impinged country of all of the various interests in Africa and the Americas that this hacking group was targeting. It seems like Cuba was the most frequent target for some reason or another. So there's a very strange story here that we should try to track over the coming episodes.
Certainly. Absolutely. I look forward to diving into this one.
El día primero aquel, lleno de emoción y ruido, alguien dijo conmovido y feliz, gracias Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel, que el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel.